So, Ken Biller, it seems that lightning can indeed strike twice in the case of Genius. You guys are back in the Emmy race with your second installment, centered on the life of Pablo Picasso. I just want to start by asking, first season you guys looked at Albert Einstein. What made Picasso the perfect subject for the second go-round?
Well, I think that, we started talking about who the next genius would be almost as soon as we began our production on the Einstein chapter, and it became this amazing kind of parlor game. Anywhere I would go, whether I was talking to my actual colleagues at Imagine or at Nat Geo or just to friends, everybody would say, "Who's the next genius?" And everybody, of course, would have a great suggestion. So I think there were really like a three criteria. There are three criteria I think for anybody that we wanted to sort of. First is, while this is often subjective, could we make the case that the person was an undeniable genius? I've been joking that the show is not called Remarkable, it's called Genius. So we're really looking for figures that are transformative in their field and that have left a kind of indelible mark and maybe changed the way that we view the world because of their work or their insights. So number one, is that person a genius? Number two, and this was really important for Nat Geo and may not be a criterion going forward in coming seasons, is the person really a recognizable figure? National Geographic is an international brand, and our show broadcasts day and date in 174 countries. And so Albert Einstein is somebody that people in Africa or South America would certainly know or have heard of. And then the third criterion for me, which is as a storyteller was the most important, is did this person live a life that was long enough and big enough and eventful enough that it could sustain 10 hours of storytelling, and that's a lot. So Picasso really kind of ticked all those boxes. I mean, when you go to the second criterion, is it a recognizable name? The list gets very small at that point. And so I think, you think of Da Vinci, you think of Picasso, you think, of maybe Mozart. There are just a few. And so Picasso emerged very quickly, and of course he lived a very long, very eventful, very tumultuous life, full of the stuff of drama. And also, I think for us as visual artists, the idea of taking on a visual artist was really important. And I think the last thing I would say, it's kind of a long-winded answer to your kind of short question, is that we wanted to tell the audience, I think very clearly going into the second season, that this is not just a show about scientists. That genius can come in many forms. It could be literary, it could be artistic, it could be political, I suppose. So that's, I guess that is how we arrived at Picasso.
Right. I mean, it is interesting going from the most recognizable theoretical physicist in history to one of the leading figures in abstract painting, and somebody who traveled the globe from Spain to France. I wonder what kind of research did you do? Because there's so much stuff out there already about Picasso. So what did you look to find the things that you were going to pull from, and to try to find things that maybe people didn't readily know about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with both figures, really. I mean, the first season was really based on Walter Isaacson's very exhaustive biography. We chose, we of course used many other sources for Einstein too. There was tons of research done by the writing staff and myself. The same was true for Picasso, although we chose really specifically not to base it on any one particular work, but to sort of approach it as biographers ourselves. And so if you had come into our writer's room anytime around this time a year ago, you would have just seen a giant table that was stacked with texts. So there were many, many biographies about Picasso himself, memoirs written, some by friends of his, some by lovers of his, some primary sources, collections of letters. Although we had fewer primary sources for Picasso than we did for some other figures, because he wasn't really an avid letter writer or a journal keeper, and also biographies of other figures that we were exploring in the series, as well as art criticism and art history. So there was an enormous amount of collective research that went into it. I don't think, unless you were a biographer who was going to spend, 10 years researching and writing a new biography, this was really a team effort with me and all of my writers. So I don't think we all read a few books in common, but most of us read books that others hadn't. So when various topics about his life came up, one or the other of us would feel more comfortable addressing those. And then, of course, as we arrived at moments that we wanted to explore, we would then dig deeper into, say, that particular time period or those particular figures that Picasso was interacting with at a particular time. So it's very research intensive. We're not doing historical fiction. I like to make the distinction that we're doing historical drama, and because it's Nat Geo and the National Geographic brand is all about authenticity, we're really trying to tell a true story in the most entertaining and dramatic way that we can. But that means that we're not going to depict things that we know didn't happen. As you mentioned with Picasso, so much has been written about him. Very little has been depicted about him on screen. So we knew that probably what we did might become, definitive for the wider public, not for historians or art historians, but for the wider public, for the average person who had just an interest in Picasso. And so much that has been written about Picasso is very slanted. Some of it is very, very slanted negatively against him, and then there are biographies that are kind of a hagiography, which dismiss any criticism about Picasso as slander and hearsay. Of course, neither is true, and we thought we would try to dig in as exhaustively as we could and present the truest picture that we could come up with.
You've gotten extremely lucky in these first two seasons to find somebody who perfectly embodies the figure that you're portraying. Jeffrey Rush in the first season with Albert Einstein, and now Antonio Banderas as Picasso. Can you talk about what made him the perfect Picasso?
Yeah, some of that was really just kismet. So as I said, we discussed many different figures. There was a lot of back and forth with the network and with Ron Howard and Brian Grazer and my Francie Calfo, my partners at Imagine, about who we were going to be taking on for season 2. But as soon as we settled on Picasso, I said, almost jokingly, well, we've got to get Antonio Banderas. Now, I said this somewhat naively, knowing, of course, that Antonio was this incredibly charming and charismatic Spanish actor. But what I didn't realize when I said that was that Antonio's not just Spanish, he's Malagueño, meaning he was born in Malaga, which is Picasso's hometown, and that he had a lifelong fascination with Picasso, grew up walking past Picasso's childhood home every day on his way to school. And it turned out that Picasso was a really important figure to Antonio and somebody that he'd considered taking on at other points in his career. So Ron Howard and I, we made a little inquiry to see if he was even interested in talking about this to us. And then Ron Howard and I flew to London to meet with Antonio. We gave him the first script to read, and which was all that was written at the time. We only had the one script, and we had an amazing meeting with him. And a couple of things turned out to be fortuitous. One, that he had not just this fascination with Picasso, but this extraordinary knowledge about Picasso, so that he and I were able to, because I'd been immersed in all this research, really just get into a really fast and exciting conversation about who Picasso was, and we knew a lot of the same kind of facts about Picasso. But secondly, as a kind of a happy accident, not knowing that he was going to be asked to meet with Ron or me, or that Picasso was even being considered for the second season of Genius, Antonio had a couple of weeks before this meeting binged watched the whole first season about Albert Einstein, and he loved it. So I think when he came into the meeting, he knew that we were, approaching the subject seriously, and that we were going to do something that was very cinematic and very high quality. So very quickly there was kind of a trust that developed. And Ron and I kind of went, I think, believing that we were going to have to really convince Antonio to do this. But it turned out, I think, in retrospect, that he really wanted to do it. He was nervous about it, but he really wanted to do it. So it just, as you say, it couldn't have been more fortuitous.
It couldn't have worked out more perfectly. So among the 7 Emmy nominations you guys got this season was, for your costume design, your hair and makeup, your cinematography. Can you talk about recreating the world of Picasso? I mean, you span an entire lifetime. You're jumping around the globe from Spain to France. So what kind of work do you guys have to do in order to recreate the period and the locations?
Yeah, that to me was, one of the most important things. And as I said, the writers, we all in telling the story did an enormous amount of research, but so did also these incredible artists, Sonu Mishra, the costume designer, and Davina Lamont, the makeup designer, Kate Starr, our hair designer, Matisse Herndl, the cinematographer. So all of these artists also had to really jump in and do a lot of research. Now, fortunately, there are lots of visual references, but often when a designer is attempting something like this, they're doing a period film, and it's basically set in one period. We, of course, were spanning decades and decades and decades in really different time periods in different places. So this really started with these designers, with R. Graywall, who was our production designer. And of course, this starts with, choosing locations. And we were, Antonio, very early on, really, he invited me to come to Malaga because he wanted to show me what Picasso's Spain really looked like. And of course, he had this hidden agenda, which was to convince me that we should shoot in Malaga. We already knew we were going to go to Spain and shoot partially in Barcelona, which has a film infrastructure and where Picasso spent a lot of his early years. But while we were in Barcelona, we thought we were going to maybe go to Madrid and shoot some other parts of the Spanish portion of the story in and around Madrid. But Antonio convinced me we should come down to Malaga, and I did. And we quickly, with Nat Geo's support, decided, well, you know what? Well, let's start this whole authentic story by doing it in the most authentic way. So the first thing that we did was we decided to shoot the scene of Picasso's birth in the house where he was born. We shot the Picasso's baptism in the church where he was baptized. We shot the scenes with at the bull ring where he went on a weekly basis with his father. We shot on some of the streets in Malaga. We found an extraordinary period apartment in Malaga that served as his uncle's apartment. So we just kicked it off with a lot of authenticity. And then, we shot not only in Malaga, but extensively in Barcelona. We shot, so for any of your viewers who've seen the first couple of episodes, when young Picasso goes to Barcelona, he quickly meets a young artist named Carlos Casagemas, and Casagemas hangs out with all of these other Spanish avant-garde painters at a place called the Quatre Gats, which still exists in Barcelona. So we shot scenes in Barcelona. We shot in front of the we shot all sorts of authentic scenes in Barcelona. So we were really grasping for authenticity. Now, of course, we couldn't afford, nor is it practical, to go back to literally to every place that Picasso went, but we did also shoot a couple of days in Paris. Then we were based mostly in Budapest and a little town outside Budapest called Szentendre that served as our Montmartre. It's very authentic looking small town in Hungary that really looks a lot like Montmartre did at the time. If you go to Montmartre now, it's too built up for us to be able to really shoot in. And then later in the production, because we knew we had to recreate in wintertime a lot of these Mediterranean locations, because so much of Picasso's life was lived in the Mediterranean, we went for 2 weeks to Malta, where we recreated some more scenes in Spain, scenes in the Mediterranean, found some beautiful homes that stood in for some iconic places that Picasso lived. So we really spent a lot of time and money going to extraordinary locations. That's what we started with. And then all these incredible designers, recreated using the resources available to them as authentically as they could these worlds. So we did have some standing sets in Budapest. So for example, Arv Graywall, our production designer, who I think criminally was not nominated for an Emmy, he certainly deserved it. He recreated the apartment and studio that Picasso worked in for many years in Paris. Really, he worked in many studios, but our primary one was one that he lived in and worked in during a particular period in his life. And Arv was able to, we were not allowed to visit this location because of some legal issues about who owns it now, but we actually were able to, I think, find some of the original blueprints, and he recreated it. So they just put a lot of effort into it, using, pictures and visual resources, and then just, of course, the storytelling. How do we create environments that help us tell the story? So.
I agree with the production, by the way. You directed the first 2 episodes of this season. I wonder, number one, if you could talk about your work there,
sure.
But also, what do you look for in directors who are going to helm the other episodes of the season? I mean, you guys set the bar pretty high, having Ron Howard do the very first episode of Genius.
Yeah.
So what do you look for?
Well, so of course you look for people who, for starters, are very talented and whose work you admire, and who have a reputation of being able to communicate well with actors. But what I think you hit on something that's really important, which is, this show is on National Geographic, so certainly there are people around the world who are watching it as it's broadcast. But of course, we know that viewing habits have changed, and many people, will binge watch a show, and so my goal always, and how I would begin with the other directors that I was working with, was to say to them, I'm trying to create here, with a lot of great collaborators, one terrific 10-hour story, one big 10-hour movie, if you will, not a bunch of individual episodes. So I'm looking for people who are going to have a certain amount of buy-in. We're going to create a style, a shooting style for the show, and a kind of a design aesthetic. And so while I certainly want those directors to bring their ideas and their talent and their creativity to the table, I also want them to do so within the context of a template that we've established. So my job at the beginning of the season was to establish a template. So, and of course, it's a kind of a hubristic endeavor, right? I mean, how are you going to visually depict the greatest visual artist of the 20th century? So it was a little daunting once I decided to take that on. We started, this was a real collaborative process between myself and Matthias Herndl, the cinematographer, and these other designers. I was really fortunate in season 1 that Ron really invited me into the process of his directing of the first episode, because he knew I was going to be really taking over when he left, and Ron is, just by his nature, extremely generous and collaborative, and so I was lucky enough to be really involved in the creation of the aesthetic of the original Genius, primarily by the fact that I introduced Ron to Matthias Herndl, and they hit it off right away. And then so we decided early on in that process, which was part of the dual time period storytelling, that we wanted to kind of try to create a little bit of a difference in storytelling style. So the idea was that for the young impudent Einstein, he would have a very handheld, energetic, restless kind of camera, and then Ron's idea was that for the older Einstein, it would be a slower moving, heavier kind of camera for the more settled Einstein. And then, we always told stories out of time on that series, even if it was an older Einstein and younger Einstein. So we always had one time frame in that story that was this kind of more settled style, and then this more energetic style. And then, Ron and Matthias made certain decisions about color palette with Einstein that had to do with, kind of cooler Middle European kind of intellectual sort of look that they created for the show. But of course, light was very important in that as well, because light was very important to Einstein. When we came to Picasso, I didn't want to completely reinvent the wheel. I wanted there to feel like there was some kind of subtle continuity between the shows. And we shot, by the way, I should say, we shot both of those two time periods with different lenses. So I thought, well, you know, I don't want to throw out great aspects of Ron's approach, which included both these sort of two different shooting styles for different time periods, but also a reliance on very close-up, wide-angle macro shots of really tight shots that sometimes of objects or activity in the foreground that would comment on or help forward the story. So I embraced those, but Matthias and I decided to do a couple of things differently and to take it further. One was we knew we needed a new color palette because Picasso was not Einstein. And we started with the idea of light and Mediterranean light that came from a visit that we made to Malaga. And so rather than these kind of cooler cyan tones, we decided that we were going to have a much warmer palette that had lots of deep reds and golds and blues. And so if you watch the show, you see that these colors exist probably in almost every frame of the show. So we started with that. We also decided that we were going to be even more aggressive with the two different shooting styles. So we were going to keep this aggressive, handheld, messy kind of shooting style for the younger Picasso, but because the older Picasso was maybe even more settled and we were dealing with a painter, we decided that, and this was challenging, but that we were going to almost never move the camera. That it wouldn't just be slow moving, it would be almost always static. And that what we would do, often in Einstein, Ron was very fond of, and I love too, these kind of very graphic wide shots, but often we would shoot them kind of off angle, like very low angle to see ceilings and architecture and, you know, create graphic images, which is great. We decided that we would, for the most part, shoot our master shots for the older Picasso, what we call 0 degree, so very flat to the surface, almost like big paintings, and we would let people walk in and out of those frames rather than following them, and that we would let often people walk into their own focus rather than pulling the focus, and that this would just you know, kind of create an aesthetic, and that we would not be afraid to kind of live in a master shot and kind of create tableaus. So hopefully we weren't too heavy-handed about it, and it felt natural in it, but those were the kind of stylistic, a few of the stylistic choices that we made early on. So back to your original question, I would brief these other directors as they came in and talk to them about the fact that this is what we were going to do. And a lot of them, you know, some of them were nervous about it at the beginning. So what do you mean I can't move the camera? You know, but what I found was that once they really embraced it, they really loved it, because in some ways it freed them up to focus their creativity in other directions. So I had a couple of, you know, really great directors that came in after me. Kevin Hooks, who had directed a couple of episodes of Einstein. I got Greg Utanis, who's a really phenomenal director, to come in and direct episodes 7 and 8. And then Matthias, our cinematographer, directed the 2-hour finale, which I'm really happy about and proud of, because he's a really terrific director in his own right. And that was something that was really important to me.
Well, Ken, thank you so much, and congratulations on
My
season
pleasure.
2. And I look forward to season 3.
Yeah, thanks for talking to us about it. And you know, it's very exciting, and we're humbled to be nominated and excited for people to keep watching the show. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I look forward to talking to you again, hopefully, about season 3.
I hope so too. Cheers.
Cheers. Have a good one.